Officer Mark Keller had worked as a cop for nearly 10 years, rising through the ranks from a fresh-faced rookie to a respected officer in the narcotics unit. Over the years, he had witnessed the darker side of the city, the endless drug deals, the dangerous street corners where violence simmered beneath the surface, and the corruption that clung to the very fabric of law enforcement. Mark had seen it all and thought he had hardened himself to the murkier aspects of his job. Yet, tonight, everything was about to change. It was well past midnight, and the city streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional stray pedestrian or the distant flicker of a neon light. Mark's patrol car hummed softly as it cruised down a familiar route, the long stretch of road marked by abandoned buildings and darkened alleyways. He had been on duty for hours, the fatigue from the night creeping in, yet his senses remained sharp. He was nearing the end of his shift, but something about the silence of the night gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was different. There was something out there, waiting. As his patrol car rolled past a narrow alley, his headlights swept across the silhouette of a lone figure moving in the shadows. It was a woman, walking slowly, her steps measured and purposeful. She was dressed sharply, far too well for a place like this, an area known for its seedy reputation and frequent drug trafficking. Her attire, a black leather jacket and high heels, stood in stark contrast to the rundown surroundings. Mark couldn't help but take notice. His instincts, honed by years of experience in the narcotics unit, told him something was off. There was an air of confidence about her, a kind of silent authority that didn't belong here. In his line of work, that usually meant one thing: trouble. He slowed the car, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. There was something about her that didn't sit right with him, and his gut told him he needed to investigate. His fingers twitched around the steering wheel, and a surge of excitement replaced the exhaustion he'd been feeling. He needed a bust, something big, something to prove his worth to his superiors. His career had plateaued, and Mark knew that making a major arrest could be the thing that finally got him the recognition he craved. But he had to be careful. The wrong move could ruin everything. He put the car in park and stepped out, his boots tapping against the pavement as he approached the woman. She turned her head as he called out, her movements deliberate, as though she had been expecting him all along. Her eyes locked onto his, calm and assessing, as though she could see right through him. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice smooth, cool, and professional, not at all like the panicked stammer he often heard from those caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mark's suspicion only deepened. There was something about her, something unsettling about the way she held herself. This wasn't the usual jittery suspect. She wasn't fidgeting or trying to avoid eye contact. She stood there with quiet authority, almost as if she were untouchable. It reminded him of the high-ranking drug dealers he had encountered in the past, those who didn't fit the mold of the typical street-level trafficker. They were calm, controlled, and used to dealing with people like him. He moved closer, his voice firm. "Step over here for a moment, ma'am. I need to do a quick search." His hand hovered near his belt, where his flashlight and handcuffs were ready if things took a turn for the worse. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she raised an eyebrow slightly, almost in amusement. She complied without hesitation, stepping closer and allowing him to conduct a quick search. Mark's hands moved over her jacket, brushing her pockets, feeling for anything that didn't belong. As he worked, he kept his eyes trained on her, watching for any sign of nervousness. But she gave nothing away. No darting eyes, no trembling hands. Just that same eerie calm. Then, as his fingers grazed the inside of her purse, they brushed against something cold and firm. Mark's heart skipped a beat. His instincts flared, and his gaze snapped to her face. She was still standing there, motionless, as if nothing was wrong. He pulled out the small plastic bag, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a powdery substance inside. The familiar white powder was unmistakable cocaine. For a moment, Mark's breath caught in his throat. He had just found what he'd been looking for. The excitement surged through him, but it was quickly tempered by a nagging feeling at the back of his mind. Something about this didn't feel right. The woman hadn't reacted at all to the discovery, and that made him uneasy. Most people, when caught with drugs, either became defensive or began to panic. But she wasn't doing either. She was too calm. "That's not mine," she said flatly, her voice unwavering. "I don't know how that got there." Mark's mind raced. Of course, she would deny it, everyone did. But something about her response nagged at him. It was too smooth, too practiced. She wasn't even trying to make a convincing excuse. She was just unbothered. That calmness only made him more suspicious. His training told him to be cautious, but the lure of a clear bust was strong. He had to be sure. He quickly conducted another search of her coat pocket. His fingers fumbled around, but then they touched something hard and small. He pulled it out, a second bag of the same white powder. This time, it was clear. He had something solid. He glanced at her once more, but there was no reaction. No surprise, no fear. Just that same composed expression. A thought crossed Mark's mind. What if this wasn't just a random street dealer? What if this was bigger? He could plant this second stash in her purse, make it an airtight case, and take her down hard. His superiors would be impressed. They'd finally see him for what he could be, a detective worthy of bigger cases, more responsibility. The rush of that thought overpowered any doubts he had. Without thinking too much about it, he slipped the second bag into her purse, making sure it was hidden beneath the other contents. "Looks like you've got more to answer for than just this," he said, his voice laced with authority as he stood up, his hand tightening around the cuffs. The woman's eyes flickered, her gaze intense, but she didn't react to the accusation. There was something about her, something unsettling, like a quiet storm beneath the surface. But Mark wasn't thinking about that right now. He was thinking about the glory of a clean arrest, the satisfaction of finally making a bust that would cement his place in the department. He handcuffed her quickly and ushered her into the back of his patrol car. His heart raced, not with fear, but with the excitement of a job well done. This would be the case that defined his career, the case that made him stand out from the rest of the officers. He didn't know who she really was, but it didn't matter. She was a criminal, and he had caught her. But as he drove toward the station, a feeling of unease crept over him. The woman had said so little, but there was something in her silence that lingered in his mind. It was almost as if she had known this moment would come, as if she had been prepared for it all along. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that this case wasn't going to unfold the way he had hoped. The ride to the station felt like an eternity. Mark Keller's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, but the thoughts tangled together like a knot he couldn't untie. The woman in the back of his patrol car had barely uttered a word since he'd handcuffed her. The calmness that radiated from her unsettled him more than anything else. Most suspects would be panicking, making excuses, pleading for their release, but not her. She sat there, staring at him in the rearview mirror, her face as composed as if this were a routine occurrence for her. He had done his job, or at least he thought he had. He had found the drugs, planted the evidence to ensure a solid case, and captured what appeared to be another run-of-the-mill street dealer. The excitement that had first surged through him at the discovery of the drugs had quickly turned into a mixture of pride and relief. This arrest would mean a promotion, maybe even an accolade. It would show his superiors that he was capable of more than just routine patrols. But as the minutes passed, that initial rush was beginning to feel like a distant memory, replaced by the growing unease that gripped his chest. When he pulled into the station, the gravity of what had happened began to settle in. His badge, his gun, everything he had worked for over the years, it was all within his reach. But tonight, everything was about to slip through his fingers like sand. He could feel it. Something about the way she had looked at him, something about her stillness in the back seat. It didn't add up. But now was not the time to second-guess himself. He needed to process the woman and get back on the streets. A small victory was better than no victory at all. He escorted her to the booking area, where the officer behind the desk began processing the paperwork. The woman didn't resist. She didn't even flinch when Mark removed the handcuffs. She simply stood there, looking almost bored as the paperwork was filled out. Mark handed over the evidence, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as the booking officer took it from him with a nod of acknowledgement. His heart swelled at the thought that this was the moment he had been waiting for. But before Mark could leave, a voice called out to him from behind. "Officer Keller, a word, please." He turned to see Captain Williams, his superior, standing at the entrance to the holding area. Her expression was stern, her face drawn tight in concern. Mark froze, his body stiffening as a sense of dread washed over him. The woman, this woman, she wasn't just another criminal. And whatever Captain Williams was about to say, Mark knew it was bad news. "Yes, Captain," Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to mask the unease in his tone, but it was futile. His stomach had already begun to twist in knots. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice taut with tension. "The woman you arrested? You may want to sit down for this." Mark blinked, confusion creeping into his expression. The woman? Who was she? What could be so important that he needed to sit down for it? Before he could ask more questions, the door to the office opened, and a man stepped into the room. He was tall, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, his demeanor just as polished as his appearance. But what caught Mark's attention was the badge clipped to the man's belt, a badge that bore the unmistakable insignia of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. "Agent Reed," the captain said, gesturing toward the man. "This is Special Agent Sarah Reed. Well, let's just say, she's not exactly who you think she is." Mark's pulse skipped a beat as the room seemed to close in around him. He turned, his eyes falling on the woman he had arrested. The same woman who had sat in the back of his patrol car without so much as a word, without any sign of fear. It was her, the DEA agent. But how? How had he not seen it coming? Agent Reed's eyes met Mark's, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical blow. She was no longer the quiet, composed figure he had detained. Now, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her expression was cold, calculating, as she stepped forward with a chilling calmness that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. "Officer Keller," she began, her voice smooth, yet laced with a dangerous edge, "you've just made a grave error." Mark's throat tightened as he tried to process what she was saying. The room felt as though it was spinning, and his mind struggled to catch up. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening as the words sank in. "I'm the DEA Chief for this region," Agent Reed continued, her tone never wavering. "And you, Officer Keller, have just planted evidence on me." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His mind went blank for a moment as the realization set in. He had planted evidence on a federal agent, a DEA chief, no less. He had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and possibly his life. His hands began to shake, his vision blurring as the walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was as though the ground had disappeared beneath him. Captain Williams stepped forward, her expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. "You've jeopardized everything, Keller," she said, her voice quiet but no less forceful. "Do you understand the consequences of what you've done?" Mark nodded numbly, his mouth dry as he tried to find his voice. He had wanted to make a name for himself, to prove he could handle the big cases. But now, all he had done was ruin his career. He had thought that planting the drugs in her purse would be his ticket to recognition. Instead, it had turned into a nightmare. Agent Reed's colleagues stood behind her, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes trained on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. There was no sympathy, no pity. They were watching him, waiting for him to crack. And Mark felt himself beginning to unravel under their gaze. His chest tightened, and his pulse thudded in his ears. "You'll be charged with misconduct, obstruction of justice, and planting evidence," Agent Reed said, her voice as cold as ice. "And trust me, Officer Keller, the DEA doesn't forget when someone crosses the line." Mark's knees buckled, and he nearly collapsed onto the chair behind him. His world, the one he had worked so hard to build, was crumbling around him. His career, his future, everything he had worked for was gone in an instant. All for a moment of ambition, a moment of pride that had driven him to betray everything he had stood for. The realization of his own failure hit him with full force. He had wanted recognition, but now he would only be remembered as a cop who had tried to make a name for himself by playing dirty. He had lost his integrity for the sake of a quick win, and now the consequences of that decision were laid bare before him. As Mark was escorted out of the station in handcuffs, his head hung low, the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He had hoped for something better, something more. But now he knew that he would never again be the man he had once dreamed of becoming. The road ahead was uncertain, and the future he had imagined for himself was slipping away with each passing moment. Mark Keller had made his bed. Now he would have to lie in it,